Hello and welcome to R&R's Ask the Expert. I'm your host, Valerie King, R&R's editor-in-chief, and I'm joined today by Dr. Aniban Basu, chief economist with Associated Builders and Contractors, also known as ABC. Now, you may be familiar with their monthly construction backlog indicator and contractor confidence index that we share on our website. Um, Thanks so much for joining me, Dr. Basu.
Oh, privilege. Please call me Aniban, but thank you.
Okay, I'll do that. All right, Aniban. Okay, so guys, it's no secret that finding skilled workers is a top challenge for restoration and remediation companies today. In fact, it's the top challenge according to R&R's 2021 State of the Industry report, which we released in August, and I highly encourage you to check out if you haven't yet. 66% of respondents consider this a top challenge now and into the next year. Along with that, increasing wages for certified employees is number 2, and retaining labor is the number 3 challenge. So, if you are struggling with finding, attracting, hiring, holding on to, or paying quality talent, you are not alone. And of course, this struggle expands well beyond restoration. Several industries share in it. That said, there's a ton of coverage out there on this topic, including a ton of thought leadership and best practices on what employers should do to address these challenges, how to attract top talent, how to onboard them effectively, how to keep them, and how to help them help your company for the long haul. But how do you really know if any of those are areas and approaches your company should be investing in? Which areas and approaches your company should focus on in trying to solve your workforce struggles? To help here, I am so thrilled to have Aniban shed some light on the external forces at play to really help us get to that bottom line, the real what and why behind this whole thing, because only then can we really begin to formulate how we fix things. By that, I'm talking about what's going on in the world, how it's shaping the perceptions people have on working, and thus what they want from employers today, right? We should know what they want in order to know what to give them. All right, that is enough from me. Without further ado, Aniban, can you please just share a bit of your background on your areas of expertise, as well as what Associated Builders and Contractors is, to help us set the stage and give us a sense of your relevance to restoration contractors?
I'm an economist. My name is Anirban Basu. I'm the chief economist to Associated Builders and Contractors, also chief economist to a number of other organizations, and also run my own consultancy here in Baltimore, Maryland. But we at ABC, we are a business membership organization. We represent the interests of construction firms, but particularly merit shop or non-union contractors. So we have some union contractors in our membership. Uh, Roughly 70 chapters around the country, tens of thousands of members, and our it wouldn't surprise me if some of the folks who are watching this right now are ABC members. And so that's what we do. And my job as an economist is to provide our members, our thousands of members, with ongoing economic insight, whether it relates to construction spending, which segments are hot, labor force issues, of course, public policy issues, all the kinds of things that would shape ultimately a construction firm's bottom line.
Very helpful. Thank you so much. Okay, now diving in. If you follow the news, the story seems to be that there are millions of US jobs available, but there are also millions of people who could be filling those jobs and aren't. So, about this term labor shortage, technically speaking, is there actually a labor shortage? And what do the stats on available jobs versus available people not taking them look like?
Yeah, technically there is. There is a labor shortage. There's a skill shortage as well, and the two things overlap, but they're somewhat different. Let me explain. So, on the final day of June of this year, there are 10.1 million available unfilled jobs in America. That was easily a record high. So employers are looking fast and furious for their next set of employees. We're coming out of this COVID-19 crisis in fits and starts. Of course, we all know about the Delta variant, but generally speaking, the economy is growing and actually has been growing quite rapidly, and that stimulates demand for people, employees. The most recent data indicate that there are around 8.7 million unemployed people. So we have more job openings than we have unemployed people. That's a labor shortage. Now, on top of that, there's a skill shortage, and that's really the problem. I mean, you can hire people out there. There are people any given time. There are folks out there who want to work, who are really interested in working and putting forth full effort. But do they have the skills, let's say, that an R&R firm would need? Would they be willing to take that kind of job? Is that a career to which they aspire? These kinds of questions. And what we're finding among job seekers is that job seekers these days have become like consumers. In other words, they are really picky about the jobs they're willing to fill. They're looking for certain things. They're looking for flexibility, obviously looking for pay and benefits, but they're looking for meaning, including social meaning in these jobs. And it's very difficult to check all these boxes. And that's one of the reasons that employers are having such difficulty filling available positions. One of the reasons. There are many others.
Thank you. Okay. Now, more specifically, can you speak to the state of supply and demand for workers in the construction industry? All of that said, does this story match the overall US labor story you kind of summarized there? Or are there nuances we should be mindful of within construction?
Oh, there are nuances upon nuances. So in construction, it's even more difficult to find available workers. And I think some of this is cultural. That a lot, if you look around, some of the finest construction workers in the country are baby boomers. They grew up at a time when they were shop class in schools. They learned very early on that they like to work with their hands and their minds at the same time. They like to create. They like to see the fruit of their efforts. And of course, construction workers enjoy seeing the fruits of their efforts. Unlike many people who work in the service sector who do work, they do a process report or whatever that happens to be, but there's not much tangible evidence that they did anything whatsoever. So, but over time, as we've entered this realm of high stakes testing in public and private schools alike, shop class has been removed from curricula. And increasingly, it's about teaching to the test. A lot of young people and their parents have become convinced that the only pathway to prosperity is a 4-year college degree. And it is a pathway for many people, but just not everyone. Colleges are starting up again right now. And somewhere out there, there's somebody taking a French literature class and they're studying maybe Moliere or Sartre or Camus, and they're bored out of their minds. But they would be the world's greatest carpenter. They just don't know it because they're not exposed to that. And so there's a cultural aspect to this. Not enough young people are looking to the construction trades. There's a flexibility time kind of aspect to this. So if you're working in remediation and restoration, you're probably working in teams. So you can't just, be doing whatever it is you want to do while your team members are working on the project. You need to be with them. So there are all kinds of challenges here to obtain that 21st century construction workforce. It's very challenging. Again, culture is part of this, and we know the baby boomers are retiring in large numbers, and that makes things even more challenging.
Thank you for that. That was a really helpful answer and really colorful, getting all the way back to school education and young folks in the future. So huge there. Okay, so um, I'm sure most of us have heard of what's being called the Great Resignation, which is another layer here. So, is that fitting for the construction industry? Are there more construction workers resigning than normal?
Yes, the so-called quits rate is really quite high across industries, by the way. It's not just construction, but construction is hard work, and there are a lot of job openings right now. And there are a lot of other industries that are looking for workers. So, it was once the case that, Amazon and Walmart paid fairly low wages. Today, their minimums are around $15. New workers are receiving on about $17 on average. I'm talking about entry level workers here. And so, in a world in which labor costs are rising, with particular rapidity at the bottom of the income scale, believe it or not. So we know that the rich have gotten richer during the pandemic, for instance. One of the things that's attracted less attention is the fact that many entry level workers are receiving much more pay than they were prior to the pandemic because of this labor shortage. And they, generally speaking, have negotiating leverage right now over their employers. And so that makes retention that much more difficult. It may be that an R&R contractor is paying more to their employees than, let's say, $17 an hour. But here's the issue: it's hard work. You've got to be on the job site when your team members are there. I might be able to find a job that offers me more flexibility, a little bit lighter of a workload, and so I leave the construction industry, even if it's paying more, for a job that pays less, but it's easier on the body and it's easier just generally speaking. And as a result, yes, a lot of workers are quitting construction occupations, even though those occupations in many cases pay quite handsomely.
Okay, very helpful, which totally segues into my next question. You kind of answered it there, but to make sure we're clear, from a compensation standpoint, are there any stats available on if and to what extent pay is going up or down within construction? And along with that, are there any correlations you're seeing between pay levels and rate of job openings filled? Maybe even retaining. I don't know.
Oh, yeah, there's a positive correlation between the number of job openings and the pace at which pay is increasing. There's no question about that. So I speak to various contractors around the country, and it's not unusual for us to see 4 to 5% increases in staff costs in any given year. And perhaps it's been a bit more significant more recently as the economy has reopened, and it's been just so difficult to find workers. And again, a lot of the pressure, as it turns out, is for those entry level workers that are being onboarded, need to be trained. That's where a lot of the expenses, and of course, not just in terms of wages and salaries, but also in terms of those training costs. And those training costs can be lumpy. So that really affects cash flow. Here's the issue: economists call it wage compression. So what happens is if a firm is induced into paying entry level workers more, at some point, the existing workforce is going to say, what about us? Who's going to take care of us? We know there's a labor shortage, but we've been here the whole time. Don't we deserve something more? And that ramps up the pay scale across the board. And of course, it's also hard to find good managerial talent as well. So they become more expensive over time. So, no, this is a period of significant wage pressure. And that's one of the reasons that we have a multi year high in inflation generally in this economy. So, yes, there is a positive correlation there. And I have no doubt that many R&R contractors have been stunned by how rapid their wage levels have been growing during the course of a pandemic that it still cost this nation millions of jobs. We're still not back to where we had been, and yet pay levels are skyrocketing.
Very good. Very insightful. Okay, now big question, but it really gets to a lot of what you have already said, I'm assuming. Want to make sure we don't miss anything big here. Through the construction industry lens, what got us here and what's keeping us here? Again, big question. But like what factors at play that stand out to you are contributing to a low rate of job applications and offers accepted, plus a meaningful rate of resignations? What aspects of the ecosystems that we are living in lend themselves to the situation? Put another way, is it unemployment benefits, which we read about so much? Is it concerns around COVID exposure? Is it a skills gap? What would you say are the key factors that got us here and are keeping us here?
There's so many factors here. I mean, let's start with the first factor: fertility. We don't have as many kids as we used to. The fertility rate for American women is in the range of 1.73. Replacement fertility is 2.1. And so, for this country to grow its population over time, it has to have immigration. But immigration policy has changed over time. And so, when you aren't having many babies and haven't been for a few decades now, when immigration policy is in disarray or still to be well defined, when immigration, generally speaking, has slowed down, when the number of prime age workers is no longer growing rapidly. Prime age are people from the ages of 25 to 54, you're setting yourself for a labor market shortage. On top of that, as you mentioned, there are some inducements to not work. So one of them you mentioned, of course, the stepped up unemployment insurance benefits. But that story is basically played out at this point in much of America. And so that should not be such a factor, at least in the next few weeks and months. But then you've had these stimulus payments, major stimulus packages, all, Americans getting direct payments, not for working, just receiving direct payments. So might not be that urgency to work. Labor force participation rate in this country is 61.7%. It's quite low by historic standards. So there's a lot of adults out there who are not working. We saw a lot of retirement among baby boomers during the pandemic. Some of that was because their 401ks got rich and fat. Most of that was because they lost a job early in the pandemic and they just gave up. They retired, they're done. Some of them, by the way, feel that they were pushed out by their employers because older workers tend to be more expensive. And as it turned out, older people were more susceptible to the ravages of COVID-19. So that gave some employers an excuse to push out their older workforce and more expensive workforce. So there's some feeling among some baby boomers out there that age discrimination played a major part in this as well. In any case, we're left with fewer workers. And at the same time, U.S. economy grows 6.3% on an annualized basis during the first quarter, 6.5% during the second. So we're coming, roaring out of this recession. Recession's been over for more than a year now, as it turns out. It ended in April of 2020. And so the economy's come roaring back. That creates lots of demand for job openings, lots of pay increases, but the people are not there to fill those jobs. And so one of the questions is, how can we induce more Americans back into the labor force? Is it through childcare support? Is it through other mechanisms? Big question. And I don't think there are many good answers out there.
Wow. Yes, you were not joking when you said there are many factors. My head's spinning. So, knowing that, You may have answered this question. It's not that easy, maybe, to provide answers. But what conclusions or hypotheses can you offer us around the frame of mind millions of people who aren't working might be in at a time where job openings are so easy to come by? What do workers want, and what are they expecting from their future employers?
Yeah, I think it depends on the generation. So, when I speak to younger people, they're looking for meaning, social meaning in their jobs. So, one of the things that R&R contractors might want to think about is how can I create a message around my business saying we do very valuable work. We help people when they're in trouble. We help people when they're sad. We help support the economy. We help, therefore, support families and keep food on people's tables. But we do really meaningful work, which, of course, they do. Remediation, restoration, something bad has occurred, maybe over time, maybe over a certain period, but something bad has happened and we want to reverse that as a society. Who does that? R&R contractors. That's very valuable, right? And there's a health aspect to this as well, or a public health aspect to this as well, having safer structures, these kinds of things. So they're looking for meaning, obviously looking for pay, but they're also looking for lifestyle. There's this notion about the millennials who, according to a conventional definition, were born between 1981 and 1996, that they like a work-life balance. And from an older perspective, the perspective of Generation X, when I hear work-life balance, I hear, well, they don't really want to work; they want more life. But set that aside, they will work, and we have some millennial workers who are fabulous in this economy, of course. Then they're motivated by the nature of that job. And so it's competition for that kind of person right now. And there's got to be a multi-pronged approach to trying to keep that person engaged with the company. But I think R&R offers an opportunity to do that because it's meaningful work.
I love that. I couldn't agree more. Thanks for putting that in words. And you're an economist, I'm not. So, okay. Now, before we go, and while I have you, switching gears a little bit, can you speak to ABC's latest construction backlog indicator plus contractor confidence index and what they tell us about the state of the construction industry?
I think they, in the aggregate, tell us that construction is busier than one might have thought. So typically, construction has been one of the last industries to recover after recessions. There's a lag. But this was different. First, construction didn't suffer quite as much as many other industries, like leisure, hospitality, and retail trade, for instance, because it was deemed an essential industry. So a lot of construction work continued. Second, the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States has been injecting massive amounts of money supply into the economy through its quantitative easing program, $120 billion in bond purchases per month. And that is ongoing, though there's some talk now that that's going to be tapered, that's going to level off somewhat. We'll see. But the point is that the investment markets are flush with liquidity and that investors are looking to deploy cash looking for return. As one of the issues here, of course, is that interest rates are very low. And so one of the places in which to deploy cash, use cash, or invest cash is in real estate and construction. So because of all this liquidity, because of the low cost of capital, even though materials prices are high, even though construction workers are hard to find, we see a fair amount of construction starts out there. And so the construction industry is pretty busy. Contractors are pretty confident. They're telling us that their backlog has grown a lot since the worst of the downturn. They're telling us that they expect sales to grow in the next 6 months, employment to grow in the next 6 months, and even profit margins to grow in the next 6 months, which I find to be remarkable because input prices, meaning materials prices, look around concrete, for instance, or diesel fuel, or all kinds of input prices are rising in cost, and people have become more expensive too. And yet, there's enough demand for construction out there that the purchasers of construction services are willing to pay enough to allow these contractors to generate some meaningful profit margin. So people are pretty confident right now going into 2022.
Well, that is good news. Before we end, last question, unrelated to the workforce topic, too. What other notable trends stick out in your mind related to restoration contractors, for better or worse?
Well, I think you're going to see a ton of adaptive reuse of existing structures, right? So one of the things we saw as an example was that many retailers went bankrupt. So in February of last year, Pier 1 Imports went bankrupt. As an example, in April, True Religion, the supplier of those fabulous jeans that make everyone look slender, they go bankrupt. Then in May, Neiman Marcus, J. Crew, J.C. Penney go bankrupt. In June, GNC goes bankrupt. Then Brooks Brothers goes bankrupt in July. In August, Lord & Taylor, that Howell department store, goes bankrupt in December. Francesca's, an apparel retailer that appeals to young women, for instance, so they go bankrupt. So lots of bankruptcy, and that translates into a lot of vacant space. Now, we know that there's remote work as well. That translates more vacant office space. We know that business travel is not returned yet, and that can translate into some pretty underutilized hotels and conference centers. So there's going to be a lot of searching out there for adaptive reuse of existing properties. But if, let's say, you have a vacant department store and you want to turn that into an outpatient center, my goodness, that place has got to be sterilized, it's got to be cleaned, it's got to be ready for that next purpose. And so even though that space might be in good shape for retail purposes, it might not be ready for a healthcare application or for a data center or for a manufacturing facility where it has to be dust-free, that kind of thing. I think there's a lot of room out there for contractors to go into those kinds of spaces and remediate. And here's the other thing, climate change. So we've seen more flooding, of course, more damage to buildings. We saw what happened recently in Middle Tennessee, for instance, a lot of loss of life, of course, and a lot of structures that were damaged. But we see that with wildfires in other parts of the country, so on and so forth. So I would tell you, R&R stands to be one of the more rapidly growing industries going forward for all kinds of reasons. Adaptive reuse is one of them, and climate change is another.
Very jam-packed with insights there. Thanks for sharing those trends that stand out in your mind. Thank you for your time and insight. Before we go, where can listeners go to learn more about you and Associated Builders and Contractors?
Go to abc.org/economics, abc.org/economics. That's where you'll see our ongoing economics reports on the workforce, on construction spending, on materials prices, and other aspects of economic life that affect construction firms. abc.org/economics.
Thank you so much again, Aniban. It's been great.
Privilege.
Listeners and viewers, for more insights on restoration, remediation, and the people behind it all, visit our website, randrmagonline.com, Apple, or Spotify. And if you haven't yet, be sure to follow the podcast to keep up with our latest episodes and give us a quick review and rating. We're also on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook, so we invite you to follow us there too. This has been R&R's Ask the Expert. Thanks again for listening.